Hello there, my name is Pavlo Shtelmach, and now we'll unveil the top news of recent days. Ukrainian military may use weapons supplied by the Netherlands to strike Russian military facilities on the territory of the aggressor country. This was stated by the Minister of Defense of the Netherlands, Ruben Brekelmans, in an interview with Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung newspaper. The minister also called on other allies of Ukraine to follow this example, noting the compliance of such actions with international law. According to him, international law does not limit the range of defensive strikes.
The right to self-defense does not end 100 kilometers from the border. We have not imposed any restrictions on Ukraine regarding operational range. This also applies to the use of F-16s fighters, which the Netherlands transferred to Ukraine. Ruben Brekelmans, Minister of Defense of the Netherlands, in an interview with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
The partners do not yet have a consensus regarding the lifting of restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons for strikes against Russia. This was stated by Volodymyr Zelensky. As the president noted, there is no consensus yet, but he remembered how worked on the use of appropriate weapons on the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea was. There was no consensus then either, but it is important to find the key to at least one country, and then others can step up. We are counting on this. At the same time, they emphasized that Ukraine is working on lifting these restrictions. According to Zelensky, he met with Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, German Chancellor Scholz, and German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and also he spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron on this issue. Currently, Ukraine can use self-made drones, unmanned systems, the development of which is now being worked on by the best specialists in our country, in particular representatives of the main Directorate of Intelligence. They already allow striking military facilities of the aggressor state at a distance of up to 1,800 kilometers. Military airfields, which are a source of constant threat to peaceful Ukrainian cities, shudder from air attacks. The entire infrastructure of Russia working for the war has suffered and will suffer losses, Kirill Budanov wrote on Facebook. After all, instead of defending its own, Russia choose to run paths of an unprovoked war and an attack on the lands of a sovereign state. And last night, just such an attack happened. Explosions were heard in 7 regions of Russia, in particular in Moscow. In Ramenskoye district, drones hit 2 residential high-rise buildings. According to the mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin, a fire broke out in one of the buildings on the 11th and 12th floors. I'm sorry, but here I want to quote the permanent representative of Russia at the UN, Nebenza. The tragedy could have been avoided if the government had not placed air defense facilities and heavy weapons in residential areas. Russian media also reported that explosions were heard near the Russian airfields Shaikovka in Kaluga Oblast and Khalina in Kursk. Moscow airports Vnukovo, Sheremetyevo and Domodedovo were closed due to the drone attack. If you see, Russians will not shoot down drones, they fly into airports and military facilities. Russia needs to introduce censorship and restrictions on freedom of information, said the press secretary of the Russian president Dmitry Peskov. After a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has entered a period of acute inflammation, which justifies restrictions and censorship justifies it. We are in a state of war, Peskov said in an interview with TASS propaganda agency. And the Russian law enforcement officers do not want to check Peskov regarding disinformation. After all, they have already imprisoned dozens of people for posts on social networks because you cannot call a war against Ukraine a war inside Russia. This is like a special military operation for them, which, by the way, is already taking place on the territory of Moscow and Kursk regions. Of course, Peskov blames the West for everything, but it was the representatives of the Kremlin who started this war, and they are to blame for everything that is happening in Russia. According to Peskov, Russia has reached a level of critical confrontation with the countries of the collective West, and the most respected international media often do not hesitate to tell lies. At the same time, he noted that when the war ends, Russia should again have complete freedom of information. We all know what complete freedom of information they had and still have, from the times of USSR. In early September, Putin said that the media in Russia are free, and the only requirement for them is compliance with Russian laws. This is firmly guaranteed by the Russian constitution. Kremlin authorities are convinced of the need for pluralism and openness in the information sphere, Putin said. And that's why all bloggers who have more than 10,000 subscribers in any social network should have to register in Roskomnadzor, so that if some KGB officer wanted to find them, he wouldn't have to look hard. After all, the Russian authorities introduced military censorship after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In particular, laws were introduced on discrediting the army and fakes. In the summer of 2023, Roskomnadzor reported blocking access to 206,000 resources with false information about the war, discrediting the Russian army, as well as calls for unauthorized actions. Since February 2022, the agency has blocked access to websites of a dozen media outlets due to repeated posting of prohibited content, including false information about military actions in Ukraine, as stated by them. According to the World Ranking of Freedom of Speech and Information, the Global Expression report, in 2022 and 2024, Russia took 148th place out of 161. At the same time, before the war in Ukraine, Russia was in the 113th place in the ranking. Therefore, in Russia, there is either Kremlin truce or none at all. And today we have the opportunity to speak with Nicolas Tenzer, the non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and chairman of the Center for Studies and Research on Political Decision, author of Our War, Crime and Oblivion. Hello and welcome.
Thank you very much for receiving me.
Greetings. So, John Kirby, National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications at White House, has commented on the recent violation of the airspace of Latvia and Romania by Russian combat drones. This is unfortunately not a new development, as it happened over the course of the war in Ukraine, where missiles, fragments or drone fragments sometimes catch up in the combat in the air and land there. So, White House has not taken attack by Russian drones falling in NATO countries as a serious one, and NATO countries have not shot them down. What do you think about that?
First of all, I think that the reaction is quite weak because that's, not the first time, as you rightly recall, that a NATO country itself is targeted by Russian missiles or drones, even if not intentionally, but I think that was not completely, hazardous if those drones, fall in those kind of countries. Because that's a kind of sign, because Putin is really trying to test, the readiness of the allies and the resolve to take very strong decisions. For the moment, it seems that the NATO country, especially under the leadership of the US, say, well, we don't react very strongly. There is probably a temptation for the US to say, well, we cannot because it will be too early to trigger Article 4 or, of course, even more Article 5 of NATO Treaty. But in fact, that's a clear signal, in my view, that if the US and the allies in general are not ready to dissuade Russia when it is attacking Ukraine, then I think the credibility of NATO itself, if Russia is attacking NATO countries, could be put into questions. And from my point of view, that could be a very dangerous move not to react strongly to this kind of attacks.
And that tendency is very frightening. It's very frightening if Russia tries, God forbid, to attack Baltic countries or Romania on land. What will be the answer of NATO? Maybe it will be too early to answer as well.
Of course, that's part of the deterrence game. There must be some unpredictability about the reactions of the allies. That's key in terms of deference. But there is also something that I quite often say, which is that basically deterrence is not about nuclear deterrence. That's about conventional deterrence. It means that if, of course, the allies consider that they are mostly protected by the nuclear shield, I think basically, it's not the point. The real point is the US mostly the US, but also the other allies, namely the UK, Germany, France, and the others. I mean, the most capable country to strike back, ready to take conventional measures against those Russian attacks. In my view, that should have been the signal sent when Ukraine has been attacked. I will say not only after February 24th, 2022, but already in 2014. If Russia attacked Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not, no, it will be soon, I do hope, a NATO country, it put into questions the legitimacy of NATO itself. It means that when the Russia is attacking Ukraine, in fact, it put in jeopardy the NATO countries themselves. So it means that basically the resolve of NATO, the credibility of NATO, is not only tested when you have attack on Latvia or Romania, etc., but even if it's Ukraine that is targeted. And from my point of view, what we are witnessing since 2 years and a half, especially, shows that there is a true, I will say, retreat. I mean, that's the right word. Of NATO in terms of duties, not because of the organization itself. Let's be very clear on that. You know, what I put, into questions is not the General Secretary of NATO, nor the NATO stats, not the NATO military commands. That's not the point, because basically they are civil servants and they cannot take action without the approval of the NATO Council. So it's basically the major allies, namely the US, that, in my view, haven't yet understood that if they don't take immediate measures, probably the deterrence itself will be threatened for a long time.
And you see, one particular country is shooting down Russian drones. It is Belarus. And I'm afraid that this decisiveness of Lukashenko, an ally of Putin, to shoot down Russian drones in Belarusian airspace will further reinforce anti-NATO and Eurosceptical moods, right-wing moods in Europe, because they see that, oh, NATO is not acting as the big brother, it is not protecting us, and the countries will further rely on their own domestic policy, and NATO could simply fall apart because of that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the right point. I think you have, of course, a lot of Eurosceptics that are saying, well, what is NATO for, or what is the EU for? Because you perfectly know that also the EU has a duty, according to the Article 42.7, to defend the allies when they are attacked. And I think the question of Belarus is rather interesting, because we perfectly know that Lukashenko regime, survives only because of the protection of Russia. We also know that there is the project of Russia to deploy nuclear missiles, into the territory of Belarus. But still, Lukashenko, who is a dictator, who is repressing, its own people, try always to send some signal that he is not fully allied on Russia's position. And there is a clear fear of the Belarus authorities also to enter into war against Ukraine. That's also an interesting point, in my view. Of course, it doesn't mean that we must not protect, the Belarusian people. Certainly, we must, and we know the ambiguousness of Lukashenko. But it's also an interesting point, an interesting signal. If Lukashenko is doing something that the NATO allies are not doing by themselves. What I do hope, I don't expect, to be very clear, I don't unfortunately expect some changes, until the last minutes of Biden's term. But if Kamala Harris, is elected on November 5th, what I do certainly hope, the true questions, and of course opposite views on that by very good US foreign policy experts, is to know if Mrs. Harris will break with disastrous, in my view, Obama's and Joe Biden's legacy. because certainly we know, I mean, the abstention of Obama after the chemical attack on Ghouta in 2013, in Syria, that basically gave a clear signal to Putin that he has a free hand to attack Ukraine in 2014. We know that the withdrawal of the American troop from Afghanistan in 2021 was as well a clear signal to Mr. Putin that he could attack Ukraine in 2022. So I think that Kamala Harris will be certainly well advised if she considers that this kind of restraint, let's say, policy basically has failed.
That is a very deep analytics. Thank you for that. And we are very grateful for you being here and really, really insightful view into 2013 and 14 and 2021, 2022. I was thinking about that too, about Syria and about Afghanistan that led Putin attack. That is quite a rare insight, and it is very pleasant to hear it from you, Mr. Tenzer. Thank you again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was Nicolas Tenzer, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and chairman of the Center for Studies and Research in Political Decision, author of the book Our War, Crime and Oblivion. And that concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching. Comment, like and subscribe to our channel for more news from Ukraine, because it is your support that really matters for us. Goodbye.